A report existed. Engineers had written it down, photographed it, delivered it, and 3 years later, 98 people were dead. The question is not whether anyone knew Champlain Towers was in trouble. The question is why knowing was not enough. The building was called Champlain Towers South. It stood at 8777 Collins Avenue in Surfside, Florida, a barrier island town wedged between Miami Beach and Bal Harbor. Surfside was the kind of place where the Atlantic Ocean was not a view, it was a neighbor. The building went up in 1981, 12 stories of reinforced concrete planted 30 feet from the shoreline in one of the most corrosive environments a concrete structure can inhabit. That geography matters enormously to everything that follows. Champlain Towers South was not a landmark. It was not a trophy tower or an architectural statement. It was 136 units of ordinary coastal life, the kind of building that housed retirees and seasonal residents and families who had saved for decades to own a piece of the Florida waterfront. 12 stories. A pool deck facing the ocean. An entrance drive running beneath the structure. It was unremarkable in the best possible sense, which is exactly why what happened to it mattered so far beyond Surfside. This was not an exotic outlier. It was every aging coastal condo. Here is the central paradox of this entire story. The warning did not arrive after the collapse. It was not discovered in the rubble. It was not uncovered by investigators piecing together what went wrong. The warning was generated by the building's own residents, paid for by the Condo Association, written up by licensed structural engineers, and delivered to the people responsible for the building 3 full years before 98 of their neighbors died inside it. The failure was not a failure of detection. It was a failure of what happened after detection. Every collapse has a paper trail. You just have to know where to look. In this case, the paper trail was not buried. It was sitting in the Condo Association's files, then in the town of Surfside's public records, then in the hands of investigators, journalists, and engineers who spent the years after June 2021 reconstructing exactly how a documented warning became a death certificate. This video follows that trail, document by document, decision by decision, because the engineering was not the last thing to go wrong here. It was one of the first things to go right, and it still was not enough. To understand what went wrong, you have to start with what went right. In 1979, 2 years before the building opened, structural engineers drew up the original plans for Champlain Towers South. Those plans were later reviewed by forensic engineers in the aftermath of the collapse, and their assessment was striking. The original design was described as robust. This was not a building conceived on a bad blueprint. The load-bearing system, the column layout, the structural logic of the thing as it existed on paper in 1979 was sound. What the plans could not account for was what 40 years of decisions would do to the structure those plans described. Construction wrapped in 1981, and Champlain Towers South opened to residents. For the next 3.5 decades, by every available account, nothing notable happened. No major structural complaints on record, no emergency repairs, no red flags that reached any level of official concern. Residents moved in, raised families, retired there, sold units and bought units, and the building stood on Collins Avenue the way buildings are supposed to stand. Quietly, unremarkably, apparently fine. That apparent normalcy lasted until approximately 2015, and the fact that it lasted that long would turn out to be one of the most dangerous things about it. 35 years of stability is not just a comfort. In institutional terms, it becomes a belief system. When a building stands without incident for more than 3 decades, the people responsible for it begin to operate on an assumption. It has always been fine, therefore it will continue to be fine. Engineers have a name for the cognitive trap this creates. It is called normalcy bias, and it is lethal in the context of aging infrastructure. The building's long, quiet history did not mean it was safe. It meant that the people who should have been watching it most carefully had the least reason to believe they needed to. And one of those deeper flaws, buried in the original construction, will matter enormously when we get to the 2026 forensic analysis. Around 2015, the quiet ended. Issues related to structural deterioration and deferred maintenance began surfacing in a way that could no longer be attributed to routine wear. Deferred maintenance is a technical term for a very human problem. The repairs that were identified, acknowledged, and then not done because doing them was expensive, disruptive, or politically inconvenient within the building's governance structure. By 2015, the accumulated weight of years of deferred decisions was beginning to show up in the concrete itself. Spalling, cracking, visible deterioration in areas that should have been addressed years earlier. The building was telling anyone who looked closely enough that the quiet years had not been free. To understand why deferred maintenance happens in a condominium, you need to understand how condo governance actually works. A condominium association is run by a board elected by the unit owners. That board is responsible for maintaining the building's common areas, including the structure itself. They collect monthly fees, maintain a reserve fund, and when major repairs are needed, they can levy a special assessment, a one-time charge to every owner, to cover costs that reserves cannot. The board has authority, but it also has constituents. And those constituents are the same people who will receive the bill for whatever the board decides to fix. That tension is baked into the system. Here is where the financial pressure becomes structural in its own right. A major special assessment in a building like Champlain Towers South does not just cost money. It affects property values, it affects the ability to sell units, and it forces owners, many of whom are retirees on fixed incomes, to come up with tens of thousands of dollars on relatively short notice. Boards that push for large assessments face resistance, sometimes fierce resistance, from the very owners who elected them. The result is a predictable institutional drift toward delay. Not because anyone is corrupt, not because anyone wants the building to fail, but because the financial incentives systematically reward postponement over action. That drift, compounded over years, is how a building arrives at crisis. By 2018, the Condo Association had reached the point where something had to be done. They hired Morabito consultants, a structural engineering firm, to conduct a formal inspection of the building. This was not a cursory walkthrough. Morabito was brought in to do a structural field survey, a systematic examination of the building's condition that would produce a written report with findings, photographs, and recommendations. The fact that the association commissioned this report at all is worth noting. They were not ignoring the problem. They were paying professionals to document it. What happened after the documentation arrived is the story. In October 2018, Morabito consultants completed and delivered the structural field survey report to the Champlain Towers South Condominium Association. The report was formal, technical, and unambiguous. Its central finding was a warning of major structural damage to the building. Not minor wear, not cosmetic issues, major structural damage. The engineers had gone through the building systematically, documented what they found with photographs and written descriptions, and produced a report that left no room for misinterpretation about the severity of what they were seeing. The Condo Association received it. The clock started. What exactly did the 2018 report document? The structural field survey was specific. It identified damage to columns throughout the building, damage to beams, and damage to walls. It documented deterioration and spalling in the columns of the lower levels, the underground parking structure where the building met the ground. It found significant structural damage to the concrete structural slab below the pool deck and the entrance drive. These were not findings buried in appendices or qualified with heavy engineering caveats. They were the main event. The report was saying clearly that the load-bearing elements of this building were compromised. Concrete spalling is worth explaining precisely because it sounds technical, but it is actually one of the most visible, most readable warning signs a concrete structure can produce. When concrete spalls, it breaks away from the surface in chunks or flakes, exposing the steel reinforcement bars inside. Those rebar are what give reinforced concrete its tensile strength. When they are exposed to air and moisture, they corrode. When they corrode, they expand. When they expand, they push outward against the surrounding concrete, causing more spalling. It is a self-accelerating process. Every piece of concrete that falls away accelerates the deterioration of what remains. But what happens when that accelerated process occurs in a place where two separate damage mechanisms meet? The pool deck finding deserves particular attention because it sits at the intersection of two problems that compounded each other. The pool deck at Champlain Towers South sat on top of a concrete structural slab that also formed the roof of the underground parking garage below. That slab was the load-bearing element separating the pool area from the parking structure. The 2018 report found significant structural damage to that slab. Water had been penetrating through the pool deck waterproofing system for years, reaching the concrete below, and the deterioration was extensive. The pool deck was not just a cosmetic problem. It was a structural one, and it was sitting directly above the columns and supports that held the building up. One of the most troubling findings in the 2018 report was not just the damage itself. It was what the damage revealed about the history of the building's maintenance. The Morabito report specifically noted poorly executed prior repairs. Someone had been in that building before 2018, identified problems, and attempted to fix them. But those fixes were not done correctly. In some cases, inadequate repairs can accelerate deterioration by trapping moisture, creating new stress concentrations, or simply failing to address the underlying cause while giving the appearance of action taken. The 2018 report was not just documenting a building in decline. Morabito did not stop at documentation. Morabito consultants did not just document the damage. They put a number on fixing it. The estimated cost to address the structural problems identified in the 2018 report was somewhere between $9 million and $15 million. That is a wide range, which itself tells you something about the complexity of the work involved. Structural repairs to an occupied high-rise residential building are not a straightforward project. They require engineering oversight, staged construction to keep residents safe, specialized contractors who understand reinforced concrete repair, and a scope of work that tends to expand once walls are opened and the full extent of damage becomes visible. $9 to $15 million was the estimate. The actual cost of doing nothing would be measured in lives. To understand why that $9 to $15 million estimate created such resistance, you have to translate it into per unit terms. Champlain Towers South had 136 units. Spread the repair cost evenly across all owners, and you are looking at somewhere between $66,000 and $110,000 per unit as a special assessment, on top of regular monthly fees, on top of property taxes, on top of existing mortgage payments for owners who still carried them. For a retiree living on a fixed income in a unit they had owned for 20 years, that number was not just inconvenient. It was potentially catastrophic. Has your condo building or neighborhood association ever faced a major special assessment? I would genuinely like to hear how that played out in the comments. The board faced a room full of people for whom the financial ask was real and immediate, while the structural risk was abstract and deniable. It is important to be precise about what kind of document the 2018 Morabito report was, because one of the things that makes this story so damning is that the report was not vague. It was not a preliminary assessment hedged with qualifications. It was a formal structural field survey with written findings, photographic documentation of specific damage locations, and clear language about major structural damage. The engineers had done their job. They had identified the problems, described them in technical detail, captured them on film, and delivered a document that any competent engineer or building official reading it would immediately recognize as a serious warning. The report was not the weak link in this chain. Something else was. Here is where the story stops being about concrete and starts being about communication. The Morabito report did not disappear into a filing cabinet the moment it was printed. It entered a chain, from the engineers who wrote it, to the condo board that commissioned it, to the individual unit owners who would have to pay for the repairs, to the city of Surfside that had regulatory oversight, and finally to the enforcement mechanisms that could have compelled action. That chain had 5 links. Every single one of them had to hold for the warning to translate into safety. And the question worth sitting with is not whether the chain broke, but exactly where. Trace it step by step and the pattern becomes clear. The engineers did their job. The 2018 report was detailed, photographic, technically precise. It named specific structural elements. It was not vague. But when it reached the condo board, it became a financial problem before it became a safety emergency. When it reached unit owners, it became a threat to property values and monthly costs before it became a threat to their lives. When it reached the city of Surfside, according to the mayor himself, it apparently did not reach them at all. The urgency that existed on page 1 of that report had evaporated entirely by the time it should have triggered a mandatory response. Between 2018 and 2019, the relationship between the city of Surfside and the Champlain Towers South Condo Association was not quiet. Academic analysis of the timeline describes that period as, quote, intense and sometimes confrontational. That word, confrontational, is doing a lot of work. It tells us there were meetings, there were exchanges, there were people in rooms together, presumably with the 2018 report somewhere in the vicinity, arguing about what it meant and who was responsible for acting on it. And yet, at the end of that confrontation, the building remained occupied, no evacuation was ordered, and no emergency intervention was mandated. But what happens when the person making the confrontation has no power to enforce compliance? To understand why city officials could claim ignorance of a privately commissioned engineering report, you have to understand one of the most consequential structural facts in American real estate governance. A condominium association is a private entity. It is not a city department. It is not a public agency. It is a private corporation, essentially, that happens to house dozens or hundreds of human beings in a structure that sits within municipal boundaries. The 2018 Morabito report was paid for by the association, delivered to the association, and held by the association. There was no automatic mechanism that required it to be filed with the city of Surfside or with Miami-Dade County. So who actually held the authority to act on that warning? So ask the governance question plainly, because it is the question that Florida and every other coastal state is still trying to answer as of August 2026. When a private entity, a condo board, receives an engineering report documenting major structural damage to a building housing more than 100 families, what is the legal obligation to report that finding to a public authority? In 2018, in Surfside, Florida, the answer was essentially none. There was no mandatory disclosure requirement. There was no trigger that said a finding of major structural damage in a privately commissioned report must be reported to the city within 30 days or 60 days or ever. That private containment created a specific vulnerability that the story would later exploit. Let's map the decision chain precisely, because this is where the story stops being abstract. Decision Point 1, October 2018. The Condo Board of Champlain Towers South receives the completed structural field survey report from Morabito consultants. The report documents major structural damage to columns, beams, walls, and the concrete slab beneath the pool deck. The estimated cost to address the damage is somewhere between $9 and $15 million. The board's decision: commission further planning, begin discussing a special assessment with unit owners, but do not evacuate the building and do not pursue emergency intervention. That decision was made by elected representatives of the people living in the building. 2 years would pass before the next critical moment. Decision Point 2 runs through 2018 and 2019. The city of Surfside is aware, at some level, that the Champlain Towers South Condo Association is dealing with structural issues. The interactions between the city and the association during this period are, by the account of academic analysts, intense and sometimes confrontational. City officials have the authority to mandate inspections, require remediation timelines, or in extreme cases condemn a structure. What they do not do is order an evacuation. What they do not do is mandate emergency repairs. What they apparently do not do, based on the mayor's own June 2021 statements, is obtain and read the 2018 Morabito report. The decision made in that window left the building in a state of partial response. 32 months. That is the window between October 2018, when the Morabito report was delivered, and June 24, 2021, when the building came down. 32 months sounds like a long time. In the context of a major structural remediation project for a 12-story concrete building, it is not. Engineering assessments take months. Contractor bids take months. Special assessments require owner votes, legal notices, and financing arrangements. Construction permitting takes months. But here is what the 32-month window actually represents. It is the time during which a building documented as having major structural damage continued to be fully occupied by families who, for the most part, believed remediation was coming. And for some of them, it was the last 32 months of their lives. Has your workplace or your building ever had a safety issue that just kept getting pushed to the next meeting? But 3 months before the building fell, someone tried to force the issue. 3 months before the collapse, someone inside the system tried one more time to sound the alarm. The president of the Champlain Towers South Condominium Association put the warning in writing. This was not a verbal complaint at a board meeting or an offhand comment in a hallway conversation. This was a formal letter, documented and dated, from the person with the most institutional authority within the private governance structure of the building. The letter was addressed to unit owners. It was an attempt to communicate urgency through the chain that had already failed to transmit urgency for 29 months. What that person wrote in March 2021 would become the clearest evidence of what was known and when. The core of the March 2021 letter is a single devastating assessment. The Condo Association president wrote that the damage to the building had, quote, gotten significantly worse since the 2018 inspection. That phrase, significantly worse, is not casual language from a worried resident. It is a formal written acknowledgement from the building's own administrative leadership that the structural condition documented in the Morabito report had not stabilized, had not been arrested by whatever preliminary measures had been taken, and had in fact deteriorated further. This was the condo board's own president in writing telling unit owners that the 2018 findings were now the floor, not the ceiling, of the building's structural problems. To understand what that clarity means in structural terms, you need to know what happens when saltwater corrosion stops being gradual. When the March 2021 letter says damage had gotten significantly worse, it is worth understanding what that means in structural terms, because the word worse understates the physics. Concrete deterioration in a saltwater coastal environment does not progress linearly. It does not degrade at a steady, predictable rate that engineers can plot on a straight line and extrapolate forward. Once water infiltration reaches reinforcing steel, the corrosion of that steel expands its volume, which creates internal pressure, which accelerates cracking, which allows more water in, which accelerates corrosion further. The process is self-reinforcing. The 2018 report had documented spalling columns, damaged beams, and significant damage to the pool deck slab. That compounding had a name inside the engineering profession, and it had a timeline. Decision Point 3. March 2021. The Condo Association President's letter is in circulation. Unit owners know in writing that the structural condition has worsened since the 2018 report. The board's response is to continue with the planned construction timeline. Roof replacement work is being organized. The special assessment process is moving slowly through the financial and legal machinery of condo governance. There is no evacuation. There is no emergency declaration. There is no call to the city of Surfside saying, "We have a letter from our own president stating conditions have significantly worsened. We need immediate regulatory intervention." The association moved on one piece of the 2018 recommendations, but the clock was already running on something else. By early 2021, the Champlain Towers South Condo Association had finally begun to move on at least one piece of the 2018 recommendations. Roof replacement work was getting underway. From a project management standpoint, this was progress. A contractor had been engaged, a scope of work had been defined, and physical construction activity was beginning on the building. For the residents who had been watching the special assessment debates drag on for 2.5 years, the sight of workers on the roof was probably reassuring. It looked like action. It looked like the system was finally responding to the 2018 report. Ken Direktor's account reveals what the board thought it was doing in those final months. Ken Direktor, the attorney representing the Champlain Towers South Condo Board, spoke to ABC News in the days following the collapse. His account is one of the most important pieces of testimony in the entire paper trail, not because it reveals wrongdoing, but because it establishes the timeline with painful clarity. Direktor told ABC News that construction to address the findings of the 2018 report was, quote, just starting to get underway. That phrase, just starting, is doing enormous work in this story. It means the 32-month gap between the report and the collapse was not a period of inaction followed by action. It was a period of planning, debate, and financial negotiation followed by the very earliest stages of physical remediation. The intervention had begun. 43 people died in the collapse, and the sequence that led to that moment had been building for decades. At approximately 1:22 in the morning on June 24, 2021, Champlain Towers South partially collapsed. The roof work was in progress overhead. The special assessment was moving through the condo governance machinery. The 2018 Morabito report had been sitting in the system for 32 months. The March 2021 letter warning of accelerating deterioration had been circulating for 3 months. And at 1:22 a.m., while residents were asleep in their units, The north-northeast section of the building came down. The engineering was the last thing to go wrong. Everything that preceded that moment, the reports, the letters, the meetings, the debates, the delays, had already determined the outcome. But decision point 4 was made in a different way than the others. Decision point 4 is the quietest of the 4, and in some ways the most difficult to analyze. By June 2021, residents of Champlain Towers South knew the building had a documented structural problem from 2018. They knew their own association president had written in March that conditions had worsened. They knew roof work was underway, and they stayed. Some of them stayed because they trusted the board's assurances that remediation was coming. Some stayed because leaving a condo unit is not a simple logistical or financial decision. Some stayed because the building had stood for 40 years, and human beings are not well calibrated to treat a standing structure as an imminent threat. The fourth decision point was not made in a boardroom. The collapse took 98 lives, and understanding how those lives came to be in that building at that moment requires understanding a specific kind of decision. When the north-northeast section of Champlain Towers South came down on June 24, 2021, it took 55 of the building's 136 units with it. The entire north-northeast section gone in seconds. 98 people were killed. The building had been 40 years old. It had been inspected, reported on, debated over, and partially remediated, and 55 units simply ceased to exist. The scale of the structural failure, more than 40% of the building's units destroyed in a single event, reflects what happens when deterioration that has been compounding for years finally reaches the point where the load path through a structure can no longer be maintained. The concrete did not suddenly become weak on June 24th. The rescue operation that followed would uncover the full extent of what structural failure actually looks like. The immediate aftermath of the Champlain Towers South collapse was a rescue operation that ran for weeks under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. Rescue workers searched the rubble for survivors while the remaining portion of the building, structurally compromised and increasingly unstable, stood adjacent to the collapse site. 98 confirmed deaths, families waiting at the perimeter, a nation watching footage of what had been, 12 hours earlier, a fully occupied residential building. The scale of the disaster triggered federal, state, and local response. And within days, the questions that would define the post-collapse investigation began to surface. Not just how did this happen, but who knew what and when. Within days, that paper trail would force a public reckoning. 2 days after the collapse, on June 26, 2021, Miami-Dade County Mayor Daniela Levine Cava stood before reporters and made a statement that became one of the defining moments of the entire post-collapse investigation. She told journalists that county officials, quote, didn't know anything about that 2018 structural engineering report. Read that again slowly. The county's chief executive, speaking while rescue operations were still underway, stated that the people with the broadest regional enforcement authority had no knowledge of a 3-year-old engineering report documenting major structural damage to a building that had just killed 98 people. The report was not classified. It was not hidden. It had been commissioned, delivered, and held by the Condo Association. Burkett's response exposed a gap between what officials claimed and what the documentary record would later show. Surfside Mayor Charles Burkett spoke to NPR on June 28, 2021, 4 days after the collapse. His account of the 2018 report was even more pointed than the county mayor's. Burkett told NPR that he was, quote, under the impression it had never even been read. Not that it had been read and not acted on. Not that it had been filed and forgotten. Under the impression it had never even been read. The mayor of the municipality where the building stood, the official whose city had been in, by all accounts, intense and sometimes confrontational contact with the Condo Association during 2018 and 2019, believed that a detailed engineering report documenting major structural damage to a 12-story occupied residential building had simply never been read by anyone in a position to act on it. Every collapse has a paper trail. Reza Sohn's response to that claim revealed something the blame narrative tends to obscure. Reza Sohn was one of the residents NPR reached in the days after the collapse, and her response to officials claiming ignorance of the 2018 report was careful in a way that told you everything about the emotional weight of that moment. She said she wanted to be careful about public officials because she believed everybody certainly wanted to think they would have done the right thing had they had information way back when. In the aftermath, every document related to Champlain Towers South went public. In the aftermath of the collapse, Surfside committed to posting every document related to Champlain Towers South on the town website, every inspection record, every letter, every engineering report. That decision, made in the wreckage of a disaster, produced something that almost never happens in cases like this: a complete, publicly accessible paper trail. The 2018 Structural Field Survey report, with its figures and photographs of damaged columns, deteriorating beams, and cracked walls, went online for anyone to read. The reason that report carries weight in engineering curricula today is not because it was written poorly, but because of what happened after it was received. The 2018 Structural Field Survey report is now a case study in engineering programs and public administration courses, and the reason it carries that weight is not because it was poorly written or technically inadequate. It was neither. It documented damage to columns, beams, walls, and the concrete structural slab below the pool deck with photographs and technical specificity. It was not vague. It was not hedged into meaninglessness. It was a clear, professional, evidence-based warning delivered in October 2018 by Morabito consultants to the people responsible for the building. The tragedy encoded in that document is not a failure of engineering communication, but what people knew and what they chose to do about it turned out to be two entirely different things. The first misconception that needs to go is the idea that nobody knew. That framing is understandable because it is the one that local officials offered in the days after the collapse, and it is technically true in a narrow sense. Miami-Dade County Mayor Daniela Levine Cava told reporters on June 26, 2021 that county officials did not know anything about the 2018 structural engineering report. Surfside Mayor Charles Burkett said he was under the impression it had never even been read, but the Condo Association knew. The board had commissioned the report, paid for it, received it, and discussed it. The residents were aware of ongoing structural concerns. The second misconception is the one every 2021 headline implied, that the 2018 report could have saved the building. The second misconception is the one the headline of every 2021 news story implied, that the 2018 report, if acted upon immediately, would have saved Champlain Towers South. That framing is emotionally satisfying and politically convenient, but a January 2026 forensic analysis published at Condo pushes back on it in a way that demands attention. The analysis argues that neither the inspection nor the special assessment saved Champlain Towers, and it goes further, stating that no amount of reserves could have fixed the fatal flaws that began with poor construction 40 years prior. That is a significant claim. The January 2026 analysis reframes the entire moral weight of the story by pointing to a different origin. The January 2026 analysis represents a hardening forensic consensus, and it reframes the entire moral weight of the story. The argument is not that the 2018 report was useless. The argument is that by the time Morabito consultants walked through that building and documented what they saw, the underlying damage may have already passed the point where repair could restore structural integrity. The flaws the analysis points to are not the deferred maintenance of the 2010s. Even if the building was compromised beyond repair by 2018, the report still had the power to save lives. Even if the building was structurally compromised beyond repair by 2018, the 2018 report still had the power to save 98 lives. Not by fixing the concrete, by triggering an evacuation, by forcing a demolition order, by putting the building's residents somewhere else on the night of June 24, 2021. The forensic consensus that the structural damage was irreversible does not erase the decision chain. It changes what the decisions should have been. The original 1979 plans were reviewed by structural engineers who described them as robust. Here is the detail that complicates every simple narrative about Champlain Towers South. The original 1979 plans were later reviewed by structural engineers who described them as robust. This was not a building that was badly designed from the drawing board. The architectural and structural concept was sound. What the design could not fully account for was 40 years of saltwater air, the particular chemistry of a beachfront environment working on concrete and rebar day after day, decade after decade, in a building where the pool deck waterproofing and drainage details would prove to be critical failure points. The 2018 report flagged something that gets lost in discussions of deferred maintenance. It noted poorly executed prior repairs. The 2018 report flagged something that tends to get lost in the broader discussion of deferred maintenance. It noted poorly executed prior repairs. Not just neglect, but interventions that were attempted and carried out badly. Repairs that may have introduced new failure modes or accelerated existing ones. Add to that the possibility of original construction defects, the kind that don't reveal themselves for years or decades, and you have a building where the damage was compounding on multiple timelines simultaneously. The saltwater environment was working on the concrete from the outside. Poor waterproofing on the pool deck was allowing water to penetrate the structural slab from above. The profession has been examining how to close that gap since the collapse. The post-collapse reckoning inside the engineering profession is less visible than the political fallout, but it is arguably more consequential for the long term. Morabito consultants produced a technically rigorous document. It documented damage with photographs, described the condition of specific structural elements, and communicated the severity of what they observed. The report did not fail. What failed was the pathway from that report to enforcement authority. Engineers can document, warn, and recommend. They cannot compel a condo board to evacuate. They cannot override a private governance structure. In the wake of Champlain Towers, Florida enacted new inspection requirements specifically targeting aging coastal buildings. In the wake of the Champlain Towers collapse, Florida enacted new inspection requirements specifically targeting aging coastal buildings. The legislation introduced mandatory milestone inspections for condominium buildings 3 stories or taller, with the first required inspection at 30 years of age and subsequent inspections every 10 years thereafter. Buildings within 3 miles of the coast face stricter timelines. The law also introduced structural integrity reserve studies, requiring condo associations to fund reserves adequate to address identified structural needs rather than waiving reserve requirements as many associations had historically done. These were not minor procedural updates. Champlain Towers South was 40 years old when it fell, and that age revealed something about the entire coastal inventory. Champlain Towers South was 40 years old when it fell, along Florida's coastline alone and extending up through the Gulf states, the Carolinas, and the northeastern seaboard. There are thousands of concrete residential buildings constructed in the 1970s and 1980s that are now approaching or have already exceeded that same age threshold. They were built in the same era, using similar construction practices in similar saltwater environments, and many of them have the same deferred maintenance histories, the same governance structures that create financial disincentives to act, and the same jurisdictional gaps between private condo boards and municipal enforcement authority. Champlain Towers South was not an anomaly in the inventory of American coastal infrastructure. Condo association governance sits in a strange legal position that the Champlain Towers collapse exposed. Condo association governance sits in a strange legal position. These are private entities, democratically elected by unit owners, managing buildings that house hundreds of people who have no meaningful alternative when the board makes a bad decision. Board members are typically not engineers. They are elected neighbors trying to balance resident safety against monthly fees and property values in a system where the financial incentives almost always push toward delay. A $9 million to $15 million repair assessment spread across 136 units is not an abstraction. Yet the Morabito report itself became something far more complicated than just a warning on paper. Think about the Morabito Consultants report as a character in this story rather than a piece of paperwork. It was commissioned by the people who lived in the building. It was produced by licensed professionals who walked the structure, photographed the damage, measured the deterioration, and put their findings into technical language precise enough to be actionable. It documented damage to columns, beams, walls, and the concrete structural slab below the pool deck. It flagged poorly executed prior repairs. It was not vague, not hedged, not buried in caveats. The report did everything a report is supposed to do. It sat in the system for 32 months, passed through a chain of decision points, triggered confrontational meetings between the condo board and the city, and the building still fell. The structure did not fail on its own. The structure did not fail. The decisions did. Map that against the 4 decision points, and it holds at every step. Decision point 1, October 2018, the board receives a report documenting major structural damage and does not evacuate. Decision point 2, the city of Surfside reviews materials through 2018 and 2019, engages in confrontational exchanges with the association, and does not mandate evacuation or emergency repair. Decision point 3, March 2021, the association president puts in writing that damage has gotten significantly worse, and the board continues the planned construction timeline without evacuating residents. Decision point 4, June 2021, roof work is underway. Residents are in their units, and the building falls at 1:22 in the morning. 4 decision points. 4 moments where a different choice could have changed the outcome. None of them required a structural miracle. The city of Surfside and the Champlain Towers South Condo Association had interactions that a 2022 academic timeline described as intense and sometimes confrontational. The city of Surfside and the Champlain Towers South Condo Association had interactions that a 2022 academic timeline described as intense and sometimes confrontational during 2018 and 2019. That is a remarkable phrase. It means there were meetings, there were arguments, there were people in rooms together who knew the building had a serious problem. And yet, at the end of those confrontational interactions, the residents stayed in the building. The enforcement authority did not mandate evacuation, and the timeline continued toward June 2021. The lesson of Champlain Towers South is systemic, and understanding that framing matters because the alternative is both inaccurate and dangerous. The lesson of Champlain Towers South is systemic, and that framing matters because the alternative, finding one villain and assigning all responsibility to a single bad actor, is both inaccurate and dangerous. The Condo board was navigating real financial constraints and real governance limitations. The city officials were operating within a regulatory framework that treated privately commissioned engineering reports as private documents. The engineering firm produced a technically sound warning that the system around it was not designed to convert into mandatory action. Each individual in that chain made decisions that were, from their own vantage point, defensible. The catastrophe was not the product of one reckless choice. It was the product of a system in which a series of rational-seeming individual choices added up to 98 deaths. The engineers had documented it all years before, in a report that sat waiting to be truly understood. The 2018 Structural Field Survey report existed. It documented major structural damage to columns, beams, walls, and the pool deck slab of Champlain Towers South in language that was clear, technical, and photographic. The Condo Association had it. The city of Surfside engaged with it. The association president wrote a letter in March 2021, warning that the damage had gotten significantly worse. Roof work was underway when the building fell, and 98 people died in the early hours of June 24, 2021. In a collapse that the forensic record shows was not sudden, not unpredictable, and not undocumented. The report did not fail. The communication chain did not fail because the information was absent. It failed because the information was present and the system around it was not built to convert a private engineering warning into a public safety mandate with the urgency that the damage required. If this is the kind of story you come here for, the paper trail behind the headline, the decision chain behind the disaster, then subscribe to Kevin's Collapse Files because there are more files where this one came from. Every collapse I cover is rooted in real documents, real numbers, and real consequences because these buildings do not fail by accident. They fail because someone made a decision and nobody asked the right questions at the right time. The Champlain Towers story is not over. The legal proceedings, the regulatory reforms, the forensic questions about construction quality, they are all still unfolding. And if you have been thinking about what it would take for a warning like the 2018 report to actually reach the people who could act on it, drop that thought in the comments, because that is the question this case leaves open.